What happens when a secret affair, one hidden behind plantation walls, spirals into a scandal bigger than anyone ever expected? Today, we're uncovering the shocking story of a plantation mistress who believed she held all the power, until she discovered that the man she secretly slept with, an enslaved man whose life was controlled by the very system she benefited from, had fathered children with multiple enslaved women across the plantation. This isn't just a story of romance and betrayal. It's a window into the complex, dangerous, and deeply unequal relationships that existed under slavery, and the explosive truth that turned one plantation upside down. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss our historical deep dives. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories reach. All right, let's get into it. In the annals of American history, there are moments so profoundly troubling, so deeply entangled with the moral failures of an era, that they force us to confront the very worst of human nature. What you are about to hear is the account of one woman's choices and the cascading consequences that would alter the lives of dozens. This is not a story of passion, nor is it a tale of romance obscured by the darkness of slavery. This is the account of power, manipulation, and a revelation that would shake the foundation of one plantation household to its core. In the early 19th century, on the grounds of a sprawling estate in the American South, a woman of privilege, of education, of unbridled access to those beneath her, made a choice that would unravel everything. But the choice itself was not the extraordinary element. What followed it would become the fracture point, the moment when the carefully constructed hierarchy of the plantation world began to expose its deepest contradictions. The woman's name was recorded in the private journals of those who lived through these events. The man's name has been lost to time, as was the fate of so many. Yet their encounter, their brief and secretive affair conducted in shadows and whispered conversations, would set in motion a series of revelations that no amount of wealth or social standing could contain or conceal. The question we must ask ourselves as we journey through this account is this: how does one maintain a facade of morality and decorum when the very foundation of that morality has been built on an institution designed to rob human beings of their autonomy and dignity? And more pressingly, what happens when the secrets of the powerful are no longer sustainable? When the very machinery of oppression begins to turn inward? When those who have wielded control discover that control is far more fragile than they ever imagined? This is where our story begins. Not with the woman's choice to betray her marriage vows, though that is significant. Not with the man's tragic inability to resist or refuse, though that too demands our attention. Rather, it begins with what came after: the discovery, the realization, and the impossible reckoning that would follow. To understand how such a situation could unfold, we must first understand the world in which it occurred. The plantation was not merely a place of agricultural production. It was a complete social ecosystem, a world unto itself, governed by rules both spoken and unspoken, rules that determined the trajectory of every life within its boundaries. The woman we are examining came from a family of considerable standing. Her father had amassed his wealth across generations, and by the time she reached adulthood, she had never wanted for anything material. She had been raised with the expectation that the world would arrange itself according to her preferences. Education was provided to her, though within carefully prescribed boundaries. She was taught to be an exemplary hostess, to manage household affairs, to present an image of refinement and grace to visitors in society. She married a man of similar social standing, a union arranged not entirely by romantic attachment, but by the recognition that such a pairing was advantageous to both families. He was a plantation owner of moderate success, extending his holdings through intelligent business practices and, as was common, through the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor. By all accounts visible to their social circle, it was a functional partnership. Children were born. The household ran with efficiency. The appearance of stability was meticulously maintained. Yet within any household, no matter how carefully its exterior is polished, there exist fractures. There exist moments of loneliness, of questioning, of desires that do not align with duty. For this woman, confined as she was to the rigid expectations of her station, those moments accumulated. She was intelligent. Records suggest a woman of considerable intellect, able to engage in meaningful discourse about literature, philosophy, and current affairs. Yet her intelligence was permitted expression only within narrow channels. Her autonomy was circumscribed at every turn. Her life, despite its material comfort, was in many ways profoundly constrained. It was into this context that a man entered the household. He came as part of the enslaved workforce, brought to perform labor on the grounds. Unlike many individuals in his position, records suggest he possessed a bearing of unusual dignity. Whether this dignity was read as confidence by the woman of the house remains unclear, but what we do know is that it began a process of observation, of noticing, of a particular kind of attention that would eventually transgress the boundaries that separated her world from his. Their initial contact was almost certainly asymmetrical in its power dynamics. She would have issued instructions. He would have received them. She would have observed him in the context of the work he performed. He would have been acutely aware of her gaze, aware of his own vulnerability, aware that any transgression against her wishes could result in catastrophic consequences for his own person. And yet, something shifted. The historical record becomes more speculative at this point, but accounts from those who later testified to what they witnessed suggest that the woman began to seek his presence in ways that transcended the demands of household management. She would find reasons to be in the areas where he worked. Conversations began to occur, conversations that persisted longer than practical necessity would dictate. There were moments, glimpses really, of something that might have resembled connection, or at least an unusual degree of attention. He, for his part, was placed in an impossible position. Resistance could result in severe punishment or sale away from the plantation. Compliance, meanwhile, carried its own profound moral and practical complications. And yet, what transpired between them did occur, whether through manipulation, coercion, desperation, or some complex admixture of all three remains a matter of historical interpretation. Their encounters were clandestine, occurring in spaces that provided some measure of privacy, storage areas perhaps, or the peripheries of the main house at night. The affair, if it can be called that, continued for a period whose exact duration is unclear from surviving accounts. But what is clear is that it did not remain contained within the sphere of those two individuals. Others became aware. Servants observed. Whispers circulated through the enslaved community in ways that could not be suppressed or controlled. The woman's social standing should have rendered such behavior impossible. A woman of her class engaging in such a transgression was violating not merely the marriage contract, but the entire social order upon which the plantation society had been constructed. Had word of this reached her peers, the social consequences would have been severe. Yet social consequences, while significant, were not the only concern. There were physical vulnerabilities as well, vulnerabilities that would become all too apparent as time progressed. Pregnancy cannot be hidden indefinitely, no matter how elaborate the attempts at concealment. The woman's pregnancy would have become visible, a physical manifestation of her transgression that no amount of social pretense could fully obscure. Yet the greater shock, the revelation that would transform this from a personal scandal into a phenomenon that threatened the entire structure of the household, came not with her pregnancy alone, but with the discovery that followed on its heels. As the woman's condition became unmistakable, investigations began. Her husband demanded answers. Servants were questioned, and in the process of these inquiries, something emerged that no one had anticipated, something that would force an accounting far more extensive than a single affair could encompass. The enslaved women on the plantation, it was discovered, were experiencing pregnancies themselves. Multiple pregnancies, not due to the standard mechanism of forced reproduction that characterized so much of slavery in America, but rather to a single source. The man with whom the plantation lady had engaged in her affair had, it became clear, been intimate with numerous women in the enslaved community. Whether these encounters were consensual, coercive, or existed in some complicated state between those poles is a question that defies simple categorization within the context of slavery. An enslaved woman could not truly consent to anything in a system that denied her all legal personhood. Yet the circumstances differed from the standard violence of slavery. This man, himself enslaved, nonetheless had exercised some form of agency in ways that reverberated throughout the community. The magnitude of the situation became apparent only gradually. One pregnancy, then another, then another. The calendar of intimacies was pieced together through interviews and observations. The dates aligned with the man's presence on the plantation. The pattern became impossible to deny or dismiss. For the plantation owner, for the woman's husband, this revelation presented a catastrophe that transcended simple adultery. He was now confronted with the knowledge that the woman he had married had engaged in conduct with an enslaved man, conduct that had produced a visible, undeniable consequence. But more pressingly, he faced an economic and social disaster. The man in question, through his actions, had effectively reproduced the enslaved population of his holding with a rapidity and through a mechanism that disrupted the carefully maintained system of control. Enslaved women who were pregnant represented both asset and complication. The children born would become the property of the plantation owner, an increase in his material holdings. Yet their father, by being enslaved himself, had created a situation that raised uncomfortable questions about inheritance, about ownership, about the very categories upon which slavery relied. For the enslaved community itself, the revelation carried multiple implications. There was pain and violation for those women who had been subjected to his attentions against their will or genuine preference. There was perhaps complex recognition of his agency, an enslaved man who had exercised his will, who had moved through the plantation according to his own desires rather than solely those imposed upon him. And there was the unmistakable reality of new lives entering the world, lives that would be born into bondage regardless of the circumstances of their conception. The woman who had initiated this chain of events found herself in a position of complete vulnerability. She could not openly acknowledge her own actions without facing social annihilation, yet concealment was no longer possible. Her husband knew, the household staff knew, the wider community would soon know. What had been a transgression of social boundaries was about to become a matter of public reckoning. In the immediate aftermath of these revelations, the plantation household entered a phase of intense crisis and uncertainty. Every interaction became fraught with tension. Every glance carried potential accusation. The husband occupied a position of wounded authority. He had been betrayed by his wife, yet he could not fully denounce her without compromising his own standing in society. To admit that his wife had engaged in relations with an enslaved man was to admit that he had lost control of his own household, that his authority had been fundamentally compromised. The options available to him were each deeply problematic. He could attempt to contain the situation through silence and the enforcement of secrecy among all who knew of it. He could seek revenge against the man through violence or sail away from the plantation. He could separate his wife from the household, effectively divorcing her or sending her away. Or he could attempt some other resolution that would preserve to whatever extent possible the appearance of authority and control. The woman, meanwhile, faced the full weight of her vulnerability. She had violated every code of conduct expected of a woman of her station. She was carrying a pregnancy that could not be easily explained away. Her position within the household, once secure despite its constraints, had become fundamentally unstable. She had no legal recourse, no agency in any formal sense. Her fate was entirely dependent upon the decisions of her husband and to some extent upon the decisions of her father and other male relations, who might intervene to protect their family's honor. The enslaved man at the center of the cascade of consequences occupied a position of even greater jeopardy. He had engaged in conduct that, from the perspective of the plantation's legal and social framework, constituted an offense of the gravest sort. An enslaved man who had relations with a white woman was committing an act defined as unforgivable within the racist legal codes of the time. Historically, such accusations had led to death, often by lynching, often carried out not through formal legal process, but through extrajudicial violence. The fact that he was the enslaved man and she the free white woman offered him no protection. Indeed, it arguably worsened his position. Yet something unexpected unfolded. The historical record, sparse as it is, suggests that he was not executed. Whether this was due to his owner's desire to preserve the value of his property, whether it was due to the complications presented by the wife's own transgression, or whether it resulted from other factors unknown to us, the man survived the immediate aftermath of the revelations. What followed instead was a process of management and cover-up. The pregnancies would proceed. The children would be born. The woman's condition would have to be addressed, whether through some form of seclusion during the period of her pregnancy and confinement, whether through some explanation offered to her social circle, whether through frank acknowledgement to her family about what had occurred. The husbands of the era possessed considerable legal power to determine the fate of their wives, including the power to confine them, to separate them from their children, to effectively render them powerless within the household. Some records suggest that this woman was confined, either by formal arrangement or through the social reality of her compromised position. She was cut off from social activities, Her movements were restricted. Her version of events was systematically controlled and limited. For the enslaved women who carried pregnancies fathered by this man, the reality was simultaneously different and grimly predictable. They would give birth. They would be subjected to the standard postpartum recovery expectations while remaining enslaved. Their children would be taken into the system of slavery, their potential as productive enslaved laborers assessed and managed according to the calculus of the plantation's economics. Yet there is a deeper dimension to examine here, one that speaks to the nature of slavery itself and the contradictions it contained. The system of slavery was predicated upon the idea that enslaved individuals were fundamentally separate from free white individuals, separate in capacity, in moral status, in humanity itself. Yet the reality of the plantation was that it was a space of constant, intimate contact. Free people and enslaved people lived in proximity. They shared meals, albeit hierarchically. They shared spaces. They shared knowledge of one another's lives and bodies. The affair between the plantation lady and the enslaved man, and its aftermath, represented a visceral confrontation with these contradictions. Here was a free woman who had chosen, through whatever complex of factors, to engage in intimate conduct with an enslaved man. Here were enslaved women who had been subjected to the attentions of an enslaved man, acting according to his own will within a system that was supposed to strip all will from those held in bondage. The pregnancies themselves, multiple pregnancies resulting from the same man, represented a failure of the system of total control. The system had not successfully prevented these outcomes. The system had not successfully managed the desires, the bodies, the agencies of those within it. Cracks had appeared in the facade. How the plantation owner resolved these contradictions would have profound implications for everyone on his property. He had to maintain his authority while acknowledging that his authority had been compromised. He had to continue operating the plantation as a system of productive exploitation while accommodating the existence of these pregnancies and the children who would result from them. He had to preserve his wife's legal status and the legitimacy of his line, while also ensuring that she faced some consequence for her transgression. And he had to manage the enslaved population in a way that did not encourage further disruptions to the system. The pregnancies came to term. The births occurred. Children entered the world at the plantation, each birth a moment that represented both hope and tragedy, new life and the continuation of bondage. The woman at the center of the crisis gave birth to a child whose paternity was unmistakable, yet whose legal status as the offspring of an enslaved man was fixed at the moment of birth. The child would be enslaved regardless of its mother's free status, regardless of any genetic inheritance of legal standing. The enslaved women who had borne children, fathered by the same man, faced varying circumstances. Some gave birth on the plantation and remained there, integrated back into the system of labor after their period of postpartum recovery. Their children were assigned to the property, their reproductive capacity having been used to increase the enslaved population. A grim outcome from the perspective of the system's logic, yet a catastrophe from the perspective of individual human suffering. Some women may have been sold away from the plantation, either because they were perceived as damaged goods, their sexuality and reproductive capacity having been compromised by their involvement with this man, or for other economic reasons unrelated to these events. The historical record is insufficient to determine their precise fates, but the possibility of sale, of separation from their children, from their community, represents a catastrophe sufficiently profound that it scarcely requires elaboration. The man himself, what became of him? The historical record is fragmentary. What we know is that he survived the immediate aftermath of the revelations. Whether he remained on the plantation, whether he was later sold away, whether he lived out his days in bondage on the property where these events had unfolded, the specifics have been lost to time or deliberately obscured by those who might have recorded them. Yet his actions, however they might be interpreted, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his own existence and that of everyone on the plantation. He had exercised agency in a system designed to strip agency from people like him. He had resisted in however complicated a manner the total subjugation that slavery demanded. And he had left visible, undeniable evidence of that resistance in the form of multiple pregnancies, multiple children, multiple pieces of living testimony to the fact that enslaved individuals possessed will, desire, and the capacity to act according to their own intentions, despite the systemic constraints placed upon them. The plantation lady's fate remains somewhat shrouded in historical uncertainty, though various accounts suggest different trajectories. Some records indicate that she may have been confined, her movements restricted, her access to society severely limited. Some suggest that her husband took steps to ensure that any future pregnancies she bore would be the legitimate offspring of their marriage, thereby restoring some measure of control and legitimacy to his household. Some indicate that her family intervened, perhaps taking her away from the plantation for a period of time, allowing for the passage of months and years to attenuate the memory and scandal of her transgression. What is clear is that she did not face the legal consequences that an enslaved woman in her position would have faced. She was not whipped. She was not sold away from her family. She was not subjected to the forms of violent punishment that constituted the standard response to sexual transgression in the enslaved population. Her punishment, to whatever extent it was formalized, took the form of social restriction, of the withdrawal of autonomy, of confinement and supervision. Yet there is a psychological dimension that merits consideration. The woman had crossed a boundary that, within her worldview and the worldview of her society, was meant to be absolute. She had engaged in conduct that she would have been socialized to regard as profoundly transgressive, deeply shameful, an unforgivable violation of everything she was meant to be. The weight of that transgression, combined with the public awareness of it within her household and community, may have constituted its own form of punishment, a psychological reckoning that persisted throughout her life. What, then, do we make of this sequence of events? What meaning do we extract from the choices, the violations, the cascading consequences that unfolded on this plantation and within this household? At the most immediate level, this account represents a failure of the system of slavery to maintain the absolute control it claimed to exercise. The man, despite his status as enslaved property, exercised his will. The woman, despite her constraints, made choices that violated the boundaries of her station. The system could not absolutely prevent intimacy, could not absolutely control desire, could not absolutely suppress the human capacity for connection or resistance, no matter how brutal the mechanisms of suppression. Yet to emphasize only this element would be to elide the profound harm that occurred. The enslaved women who were subjected to this man's attentions, who carried pregnancies not of their choosing, who gave birth to children who would inherit their bondage, these women experienced exploitation that was real and devastating. The children born into bondage experience the catastrophe of enslavement, a catastrophe that no amount of recognition of human resistance can erase or diminish. The plantation lady, for her part, engaged in conduct that was predicated on a fundamental violation of the humanity of the enslaved man. Whatever attraction or connection may have existed between them, it occurred within a context of absolute power imbalance. She could take what he could not refuse. She could expose him to consequences he could not escape. Her choice to engage in this affair, whatever her personal motivations, was a choice made by a person with power engaging with a person stripped of power by the system that bound them together. The system itself, the system of slavery, the system of racial domination, the system of patriarchal control, emerges from this account as exactly what it was: a system predicated on violence, on the suppression of human will and human dignity, on the extraction of labor and reproductive capacity from those deemed to be less than human. The fissures that appeared in this system through the events we have examined do not represent the heroism of individuals, but rather the fundamental hollowness of a system that claimed to operate through natural law while requiring constant, vigilant, brutal enforcement to maintain itself. What is remarkable about this account is not that it reveals individuals acting with sudden agency or dignity within an impossible system. What is remarkable is that it reveals how even the most rigid systems contain contradictions that become visible when we examine them closely. The plantation lady's transgression exposed the absolute arbitrariness of the categories upon which slavery relied. The man's exercise of his will exposed the fact that the system could not achieve the total subjugation it claimed. The pregnancies of the enslaved women exposed the way in which the system used the bodies of the vulnerable as resources to be extracted and exploited. For historians and students of this period, this account serves as a window into the realities of slavery. Not slavery as a system of abstract economics or legal categories, but slavery as a lived experience of intimacy and violation, of constraint and resistance, of power exercised and agency asserted, all occurring within a framework that was designed to maximize human suffering and the accumulation of wealth for a chosen few. The individuals at the center of these events are, for the most part, names without full faces, details without complete narratives. The historical record has not preserved their thoughts, their feelings, their full lived experiences. We are left with fragments, with accounts filtered through the perspectives of those with power to record and preserve the official narrative, with silence where enslaved individuals might have spoken about their own experience. Yet these fragments are enough to tell us something true about the world of slavery in America. They tell us that the system was unstable, that it required constant vigilance and violence to maintain itself, that it contained within itself the seeds of its own contradictions. And they tell us something about the people within the system, both those who benefited from it and those who suffered under it, that forces us to confront the full complexity and tragedy of this era of American history. The plantation lady's affair, the pregnancies that followed, the revelations that shattered the carefully maintained facade of her household. These are not a story of romance or redemption. They are a story of a system that dehumanized people, that demanded absolute obedience while being incapable of achieving it. That created circumstances where violence, violation, and transgression became inevitable consequences of the attempt to maintain the impossible. As we conclude this account, we are left with questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of this plantation this household, this woman, and the man whose encounter set everything in motion. We are left asking how societies justify the unjustifiable. We are left asking how systems of oppression maintain themselves despite their fundamental immorality. We are left asking what it means for human beings to remain human within systems designed to strip them of humanity. And most importantly, we are left with the responsibility to remember, to ensure that these stories, fragmented and incomplete as they may be, are not erased from our collective memory, to ensure that the people who lived through these events are not forgotten, and to ensure that the system of slavery, with all its brutality and all its contradictions, is understood not as a historical artifact that can be relegated to the past, but as a foundational element of the American experience, whose consequences and moral reckoning continue to shape our world